Down below, Daniel Archer stood motionless at the edge of the sand. He was no trainer, no rider, not a polished man in gleaming boots or a tailored jacket. He was the janitor. The one who mended hinges, swept stalls, and faded into the background as though shadows had claimed him long ago. Grease stained the cuffs of his faded shirt. Dust clung stubbornly to his worn boots. He looked like the last man anyone would expect near a spotlight. And yet, when Isabel's challenge rang through the arena, Daniel did not falter. His eyes stayed locked on Nick's. Not with fear, but with something far more unsettling. Patience, perhaps. Or the kind of knowing carved into a man by scars he never spoke of. He didn't see a monster thrashing in the sand. He saw a terrified creature crying in the only voice it knew. The investors leaned forward, disbelief etched across every face. Surely this quiet nobody would shake his head, retreat, and apologize for stepping too close. Surely Isabel's scorn would flatten him where he stood. But Daniel lifted his chin instead, his voice low and steady, carrying across the space with a calm that seemed to freeze the air. I accept. Laughter died on the spot. Even Nix paused, ears flicking toward the sound. Isabel's smirk wavered, control slipping before the very people she had meant to impress. She had set a trap meant to bury a man in shame, and instead, he had turned her jest into a vow. In that breathless silence, something shifted. A janitor with nothing to his name had just stepped up to challenge not only the most volatile horse in Boston, but the woman who ruled an empire built on control. And for the first time in years, Isabel Rowan felt the ground beneath her heels tremble. The silence pressed heavy, weighing on every chest in the arena. Isabel's perfect mask had cracked at the edges, but all eyes were no longer on her. They were on him. Daniel Archer, in grease-stained cuffs, standing as though he had every right to be there. Nix, moments ago a storm of fury, pawed the ground and snorted, black coat glistening with sweat under the harsh lights. His power was undeniable, his rage terrifying, yet Daniel didn't move away. His shoulders loosened, posture quiet, unthreatening. He raised no hand, gave no command. He simply breathed, steady and slow. A still point in the storm that had shattered everyone else. Trainers shouted frantic warnings. Get back. He'll kill you. Panic sharpened their voices, but Daniel's gaze never wavered from the horse. Where they saw danger, he saw details, an ear twitching, the whites of Nix's eyes flashing, the tremble in his flanks. Not rage. Desperation. And Daniel offered the stallion something no one else had. Space. Time. Calm. From the stands, a child's voice sliced through the tension like a bell. Daddy. Barely a whisper, yet every head turned. Sophie Archer clutched the railing, her wide eyes fixed on him. Only 8 years old, her hair falling in a soft tumble around her face, fear and faith tangled in her expression. She had watched the chaos helplessly, her heart tethered to the man standing so close to danger. Daniel heard her for the first time since stepping forward. His gaze flicked away from Nix for just a heartbeat, finding his daughter. To the crowd, it was nothing but a glance. But Sophie saw the whole message in his eyes. A nod. A promise. It's all right. In that instant, the shape of the challenge changed. It wasn't Isabel's empire on the line. It wasn't the investors waiting to be impressed. It wasn't even about the $10 million stallion tearing at the ground. It was about a father and his daughter, about proving to a little girl who had lost too much that monsters, no matter how loud or how large, could be met without fear. Nick stomped once, a violent warning. But Daniel held his ground. He tilted his head ever so slightly, a gesture of curiosity, not defiance. His body spoke silently, I am not here to break you. I am here to stand with you. The stallion's ears flicked forward, uncertain, but the wild panic in his eyes slowed. The air softened, only by a thread, but enough to shift the entire arena. Investors leaned forward again, disbelief tightening their faces. How could a janitor, an invisible man in their glittering world, stand unarmed before the beast that had sent Olympians fleeing? Isabel watched, lips pressed into a thin line, fury sparking behind her eyes. This was not the script. He was not supposed to calm the chaos. He was not supposed to remind everyone that dignity could come wrapped in grease and dust. But he had, and with a single nod to his daughter, Daniel Archer revealed what Isabel had missed. He wasn't a man driven by ego. He was a father carrying a promise. Sophie would see him stand tall. She would learn that monsters could be stilled, and that trust could outlast fear. Nix blew a sharp snort but did not charge. For the first time that day, the arena held not terror, but a fragile thread of hope. Hope spun between a wild horse, a quiet man, and the little girl who called him daddy. The silence branded itself into memory. Investors left murmuring, shoes clicking on marble floors as if trying to stomp away the unease Daniel had planted. Isabel Rowan did not leave unsettled. She left furious. A janitor had stood where champions had fallen, looked her straight in the eye, and accepted a challenge meant to humiliate him. Worse, he had walked away carrying dignity instead of disgrace. By morning, the story had grown legs. Stable hands whispered of the bet. Employees traded wide-eyed retellings. Even the board sent cautious inquiries to Isabel's office. She hated gossip, but she hated mysteries more. And Daniel Archer was now both. She summoned Finn, her young assistant, who entered clutching a tablet like a shield. "The file," Isabel ordered, her tone sharp as glass. "What do we know about Archer?" Finn hesitated, shifting nervously. "That's just it, ma'am. Almost nothing." Her eyes narrowed. "Nothing? He works here. People don't just appear out of thin air." Finn swallowed and scrolled through the sparse record. Employed with Rowan Quinn for 2 years. Before that, janitorial work at a warehouse across state lines. Before that, nothing. No school records, no licenses, no debts, no history. It's as if Daniel Archer didn't exist before a decade ago. For a long moment, Isabel stared at the screen, the emptiness mocking her. She built empires on data, trusted numbers over instinct. Yet here stood a man who seemed to exist only in the present. No trail, no past, just a ghost with calloused hands and a little girl who called him daddy. "Keep digging," she said at last, her tone sharp enough to cut. "Everyone leaves something behind. No one simply vanishes." "Yes, ma'am," Finn stammered, retreating before her fury turned on him. Alone in her pristine office, Isabel replayed the memory of the arena, Nix's ears flicking toward Daniel, the stallion's rage thinning under stillness. And that fleeting nod toward the child. Not bravado. Something else. She leaned back in her leather chair, exhaling a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Doubt was foreign to her, yet here it was, needling at her edges. Daniel Archer was not who he appeared to be, and the mystery gnawed at her like a splinter under skin. Rumors spread. Some claimed he was a disgraced writer hiding from scandal. Others whispered of military training and secrets buried deep. Isabel dismissed speculation, she wanted facts. Until she had them, she would not rest. By the third day, whispers boiled over. Stable hands lingered at stalls. Executives whispered behind closed doors. Investors waited with sharp eyes to see whether Isabel would own the challenge or collapse under it. That morning, she summoned Daniel Archer to her penthouse office. He arrived looking nothing like a man about to negotiate with one of Boston's most powerful CEOs. Shirt sleeves rolled, faint smudges of hay and leather marking the fabric. He carried himself without apology, as if marble floors were no different from dirt-strewn stables. Isabel, flawless in her tailored suit, regarded him coolly. Sliding a thick leather-bound contract across the desk, she said crisply, "Our agreement. Drawn up by my attorneys. It outlines the terms with Nix." Daniel picked up the file, flipping through dense legal pages, liability waivers, NDAs, clauses granting Rowan equine rights to record, study, and replicate his methods. Isabel watched closely, expecting confusion or intimidation. Instead, he read with slow, steady calm. Then, without asking, he rose. Crossing to Finn, he plucked a pen from the trembling assistant's hand. Returning, he began to strike through entire paragraphs. He cut out media clauses, erased rights to analyze his methods, stripped away language that would reduce his work to numbers. At the bottom, he added one sentence in bold strokes. All sessions with Nix are to be conducted in private. No observers, no censors, no interference of any kind. He slid the file back, voice low but final. These are my terms. Audacity hung thick in the air. Finn's eyes widened. Corgan, the head trainer, scoffed. Ridiculous. How can we assess progress without observation? His methods could be dangerous. Daniel turned his gaze to Corgan, steady and unyielding. My methods are not your concern. Then back to Isabel, calm, certain, uncompromising. For the first time in years, Isabel felt her composure fracture. Her empire thrived on data, on control measured to the decimal. Privacy was an enemy. Yet here stood a janitor demanding faith. Her pride screamed to shred the document, to expose the farce. And yet, the memory of the arena pressed in. Nix softening beneath Daniel's silence. She could not explain it. The room held its breath until Isabel spoke. Fine, she said at last, each word heavy. You have your privacy. Your first session begins this afternoon. Don't be late. Daniel nodded once. Not victory, not plea, just certainty. Then he left as calmly as he had entered. Alone, Isabel stared at the amended contract. She told herself she still held the reins. But deep down, she knew the truth. The janitor had not just rewritten her contract. He had shifted the rules of her world. The first session began without spectacle. Daniel entered the reinforced paddock alone, closing the gate softly. Nix stood quivering, eyes wild with the same fire that had broken Olympians. Everyone expected Daniel to approach with rope or bridle, to assert control. Instead, he leaned against the fence, arms loose, gaze soft, and waited. Minutes bled into an hour. Nix paced, reared, charged, his hooves pounding thunder. Each time, Daniel never flinched. Never stepped forward or back. He simply stood steady, an unmoving center inside chaos. On hidden cameras, staff scoffed. To Isabel, watching secretly from her monitor, it looked like defiance. The next day was the same. And the next. Every afternoon at 3, Daniel entered, leaned on the fence, and let the stallion rage. Stable hands mocked it as the janitor's meditation. Corgan sneered, certain humiliation would follow. Isabel pretended dismissal, yet found herself glued to the footage. Infuriated, but unable to look away. After nearly a week, she sought him out. She found him in the tack room, oiling worn leather. The smell of saddle soap hung sharp in the air. He worked with the same quiet focus he carried everywhere. What exactly do you think you're doing, Archer? Her voice cut across the room. Standing still won't break a horse. You're wasting time. Daniel looked up slowly, blinking as if surprised to see her. He set the bridle aside, wiped his hands, and met her gaze with steady calm. I'm not here to break him, he said. Isabel let out a bitter laugh. He's a horse, not a philosopher. He needs obedience. You break something when you want it shattered, Daniel replied softly. Trust doesn't work that way. You can't force it. You can only offer it. His certainty stunned her, even if only for a beat. So your grand method is to wait? To let him scream hoarse while you lean on a fence? Every person who's entered his space came wanting something, whips, syringes, ambition. They pushed until he fought. I'm teaching him something new. That sometimes a human means nothing at all. Quiet. Safety. For once, Isabel had no retort. His words clashed with everything she believed: control, precision, metrics. And yet she remembered it, Nix's ears flicking forward, rage faltering when Daniel had stood calm. She had seen it herself. "You're a fool," she snapped finally, though her voice carried no conviction. Turning, her heels struck the floor like gunfire as she left him to the silence. Daniel returned to the bridle, hands steady. Isabel would not understand. Not yet. But the stallion would. Nix's storm could not rage forever. And when it broke, someone would have to be waiting, steady, unshaken, and ready to show him that trust was possible. For days, Isabel Rowan watched the footage, questions mounting with no answers. Daniel Archer entered the paddock, leaned against the fence, and somehow bent chaos into something dangerously close to peace. It rattled her more than she dared admit. Control was her language. Data was her scripture. Yet here was a man who spoke in silence, and a stallion that seemed to understand. She couldn't ignore it. She hired someone who never failed her, an old private investigator, experienced enough to know that even ghosts leave tracks if you know where to look. The file arrived bound in leather, heavier than she expected, faintly scented with dust and ink. Isabel locked her office door, drew the curtains against the Boston skyline, and opened it with a hand that trembled more than she wished. What lay inside shattered everything she thought she knew. The first pages were grainy photographs clipped from small-town papers. A young man, taller, but unmistakably Daniel, stood beside a woman with midnight dark hair and a laugh so bright it leapt off the faded print. Claire Archer, his wife. Together they had been called a phenomenon, the heirs of a legacy whispered about in equestrian circles, the Archer way. The article spoke of it with reverence, as if describing art rather than technique. Where others broke horses with whips and force, the Archers listened. They taught riders to meet a horse not with domination but empathy, to speak in the quiet language of weight and breath. Old ranchers spoke of it as though it were magic. And at the center of it was Daniel, described as the most gifted of his line, a man able to calm the wildest spirit with nothing but his presence. As Isabel turned the pages, the clippings grew brighter. Headlines celebrated victories. Photographs captured Claire soaring across arenas with fire in her eyes, Daniel at her side, steady as stone. Together, unstoppable. Until the pages darkened. One stark headline froze her hand mid-turn: National Rodeo Finals. Equipment failure. Horse down. Champion Claire Archer killed in tragic accident. The article was brief, clinical, almost cruel in its coldness. A buckle snapped. A fall. A life ended in dust. And just like that, the trail ended. Daniel Archer vanished, from the circuit, from the press, from the world. He walked away carrying his daughter and his silence, leaving behind only whispers of the Archer way. Isabel leaned back in her chair, staring at the scattered photographs. The janitor she had mocked before her investors wasn't a janitor at all. He was the last son of a forgotten tradition, a man born with a gift she had dismissed as luck. She thought of Sophie's small voice calling, "Daddy." She thought of Daniel's nod, his promise of safety. This wasn't defiance. This wasn't spectacle. It was legacy. And for the first time in her life, Isabel felt something colder than doubt. She felt shame. The careless bet, the mocking words, they now clung to her like blasphemy. She had tried to reduce him to nothing. But Daniel Archer was not nothing. He was everything her empire had pretended to master but never truly understood. The Archer way lived, and it stood in her stables, quietly waiting to be remembered. The revelation of Daniel's past weighed on her like an anchor she couldn't set down. She buried herself in meetings, contracts, the endless rhythm of numbers and negotiations that usually steadied her. But the file lingered. The faded clippings haunted her desk. And worse, every day. At 3 o'clock, her eyes betrayed her. They drifted to the hidden monitor where Daniel and the black stallion stood in silence. She had expected to confirm her suspicion, that he was deluded. But instead she saw change. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Nix's charges grew shorter. His screams less piercing. The wild white of his eyes gave way to curiosity. Isabel hated it, not because it disproved her, but because it stirred something she had buried, the part of her that longed to believe in gentleness. And then Sophie shifted everything. The little girl appeared more often at the stables. Always quiet at first, hovering just behind her father. One evening Isabel found her cross-legged on a hay bale, a book of fairy tales open in her lap. Her soft, steady voice drifted through the barn as she read aloud. And there stood Nix, the terror of Rowan Equine, ears pricked forward, listening as if each word carried weight. Isabel froze in the doorway. She wasn't supposed to be there. CEOs didn't linger in barns at dusk. But something rooted her in place. She leaned against the frame, unnoticed, and listened. The child's voice, the turning of pages, the stallion's slow, calm breaths. It was a harmony no algorithm could capture. Her throat tightened. For the first time in years, she simply stood and felt. The next day she brought food. Not for Daniel, though she left it where he would find it, but for Sophie. Fresh fruit, bread still warm from the company cafeteria. She told herself it was practicality. But when Sophie looked up with wide eyes and whispered, "Thank you," something inside Isabel shifted. In the weeks that followed, she found reasons to stay longer. At first she hovered at the edges under the guise of oversight. Then she carried buckets, fixed gates, even brushed down a mare in the adjoining stall. Slowly, she traded heels for boots, suits for a sweater she hadn't worn in years. Each act chipped away at the armor she had spent a lifetime forging. One evening Sophie tugged her sleeve, asking shyly, "Would you like to sit with us?" Isabel hesitated, but the invitation was too human to refuse. She lowered herself onto the hay beside the child, listening as Sophie read another story to the horse. Daniel said nothing. But when their eyes met across the dim barn, Isabel saw no judgment. Only quiet acknowledgement. In that fragile moment, surrounded by the smell of hay, the sound of a little girl's voice, Isabel Rowan finally understood what she had never admitted. Power and control had built her empire. But it was trust, patience, and the unshakable courage of a child that could mend what was broken. And slowly, without realizing, she herself was being mended too.